Well, friends, thanks so much for joining us. He's one of the people who inspires us. When I think of James Corbett, one word comes immediately to mind: prolific. He's an investigative journalist, documentary filmmaker, writer, podcast host, and one of the most intelligent, consistent, informed, and unshakable voices in the alt-truth media space. His website is the Corbett Report, corbettreport.com. His YouTube channel is also called the Corbett Report and has more than 80,000 subscribers with more than 19 million video views. He produces the eye-opener for Sybil Edmonds' site, boilingfrogspost.com. He's the co-host of New World Next Week with James Evan Plato, and he's a regular writer and contributor to the International Forecaster, our good friend Bob Chapman's publication. He's also the talented video storyteller who brought us perhaps the single best 5 minutes of truth about the events of 9/11 with his simply perfect video titled 9/11, A Conspiracy Theory, which has now been seen by more than 2.3 million people so far. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome James Corbett.
Well, hi, Sean. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate you and the work you're doing as well.
Well, it's a real thrill. I got to tell you, we hear names like Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi a lot. We should hear your name more in the regular media sphere because I don't think that there's anybody who is quite as prolific as you. And I have to ask you, where in the world did you find time, on top of everything else, to create this new documentary, Century of Enslavement, the History of the Federal Reserve?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll let you know when I figure it out myself. Perhaps the most baffling part of all of this is that I believed I was going to be able to do this in 1 month. Of course, it ended up taking me 7 months in order to put it out, so perhaps even I am not quite as much of a miracle worker as I like to believe.
Well, it's a stunning recap of what humanity is up against, and the good news is there are many of us from all different walks of life that are waking up, so we can talk about your documentary. One of the things I did want to talk about, though, is your piece, 9/11, A Conspiracy Theory. And, for those who haven't heard it or seen it yet, it's 5 minutes long. You can find it on James's YouTube site, Corbett Report. Just search YouTube, Corbett Report, and that's 2 T's, Corbett Report. And you got to Google this, 9/11, A Conspiracy Theory. Let's listen just to the first portion.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York, while in Washington, a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the Budget Analyst Office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th.
It leaves you breathless. It is just so perfectly written and perfectly crafted, James. How did you manage to pull that one off? It's a home run.
Well, thank you for that, and I've certainly heard that from a lot of people over the past few years. Basically, that was intended as an inside joke for the 9/11 truth community, so I was staggered when it became a viral video and took off with the general public, because really what this is a condensation of, at that point, I believe my 5 or 6 years of research into 9/11 truth, into as compact a space as I possibly could, and of course the point of the entire video is simply that the official story, the official conspiracy theory of these 19 men conspiring with Osama bin Laden is so ridiculous that it parodies itself. I mean, just telling the story that they actually want us to believe is so ludicrous that it's funny. It's actually funny to just listen to this story, and that was really the whole point and genesis of that. And it was an idea that occurred to me probably a few weeks before I actually put the video out, and I was just knocking it around in my head. I had the first few lines just sort of stuck in my head, and I was just repeating them and trying to get into the sense of that voice. And then it all came in a rush. I think I wrote and made the video in 1 day, I believe. And that was just me sitting at home in my pajamas on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, which was when it was released. So it staggers me that caught on with the general public, but I'm glad that it did.
Well, it's a masterwork, and what leaves me speechless about it is that it's been seen on your YouTube channel alone 2.235 million times, and I know that other YouTube channels have taken it and posted it as well, and it's just a wonderful precursor or primer for those who are now beginning to wake up and question this New World Order, essentially, for lack of a better phrase, but these powers that are in control of our government, these central banking powers, which we're going to talk about. This is such a wonderful primer for those people who then might be inspired to dig deeper into the work of David Ray Griffin, Stephen Jones, AE 9/11 Truth, Kevin Ryan and his top 10 connections between NIST and nanothermites. Obviously, you and I know, and the listeners know, that the rabbit hole goes far, far, far deeper than you could possibly encompass in this 5 minutes, but I just can't believe it's been 13 years since 9/11 and 3 years since you made this great microdoc.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I can't really believe that either. I mean, it doesn't seem like that much time has elapsed since 9/11 actually occurred. It seems like the blink of an eye. And yet, from the other perspective, it staggers me to think there's an entire generation of young people who are growing up right now who really haven't known anything other than this war on terror, police state mentality that the United States and really much of the world was plunged into as a consequence of 9/11. So it is extremely important to let that generation, and of course every other generation, know that at base what we are being asked to swallow with this story is itself a self-evident, ridiculous lie, and I think the best way to expose that really is to laugh at it. There are many ways to treat a tyrant, but the one thing they really can't stand is to be made fun of, and I think, honestly, the Emperor's New Clothes story is really a story about laughing at the Emperor rather than be cowering in fear at him, and I think that's the way we have to treat the current situation and the powers that shouldn't be, who really do want to use the events of 9/11 to continue. I mean, they will continue to parade on the graves of those people who died that day, as long as that agenda continues to serve their interests. And I think that, again, the best way to counteract that is simply laughing at them and their ridiculous story, and letting them know that a vast number of people in the public, and a growing number, just simply won't buy into their propaganda.
Well, it's astounding, too, as we approach September 11th, being less than a month away. It's astounding that literally everybody in media, I mean, you can pick your favorite media outlet if it's a mainstream Mockingbird media outlet. It doesn't matter where it is. It could be Fox News, it could be CNN, it could be MSNBC, it could be the Wall Street Journal, it could be the New York Times, it could be Time Magazine, it could be whatever it is that you think is great, Huffington Post. They will continue to malign those of us with critical thinking skills who question the official story of 9/11. Like we are tinfoil hat-wearing nuts, which is astounding, especially when you know the CIA itself rolled out a plan after the JFK assassination to malign those that would dare to ask questions and bring up ideas like conspiracy theories. It's all a plan. It's a plan to circumvent justice and truth, and your documentary helps open eyes. But don't you find it astounding that they can still get away with maligning those of us that would dare question the official story?
I don't really find that surprising in the least, to tell you the truth. And just for those who are interested, the document you're referring to there is CIA document 1035-960. Just type that into a search engine and you can read the document that was released in 1967 as the public was beginning to become more skeptical of the official findings of the Warren Commission. And they were talking in that document about the fact that these conspiracy theories continue to be propounded, and we have to try to connect them to communist forces that are trying to sow the seeds of doubt in the American public and things of that nature. The CIA openly talking about how to use these terms like conspiracy theory against the people who would question their official narrative. And of course, it was very much the CIA's official narrative with Dulles, Alan Dulles, of course, one of the main people who would be seen as a suspect in the JFK assassination, having been on that Warren Commission that, of course, found Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone nut. So it is an exceptionally effective term. It has been since it was coined and parroted out through the Mockingbird media, which is why I do not find it surprising in the least that even though, for example, 80 to 90% of the public, depending on the polls that you look at, no longer believe in the lone nut Lee Harvey Oswald theory in the JFK assassination, still they will continue to act as if it is absolutely monolithic, unquestionable truth that he was the lone assassin. So that doesn't surprise surprise me in the least. The thing that I'm much more disappointed in is the fact that there is still a large contingent in the alternative, or the so-called alternative media, including some of those names that you mentioned earlier, who will not at all ever go anywhere near towards fundamentally questioning the events of 9/11, because I assume, because these people want to become part of that mainstream system and want to be taken seriously in the mainstream. So they pander and they refuse to go into these areas. And that's very much to the detriment of the alt media generally, because unfortunately it fosters a mindset amongst people who I think would otherwise be inclined towards questioning these events, who won't do so because they don't see their so-called heroes doing so. And I find that much more disappointing than the corporate media just doing what the corporate media does.
Yeah, I do too. And the same goes for Amy Goodwin there over at PBS.
Democracy Now!, yeah.
Yeah, Democracy Now! I mean, I do respect a lot of their work and admire a lot of their interviews, but, they tend not to go after the 9/11 truth either, and she was there that day. She was blocks away from World Trade Center 7 as it came down. You can see her in video as that building collapses. If anybody should have been reporting about it, it should be Amy, but I digress. You know what? Here's the bottom line of what we're talking about, folks. If you want to understand how we got where we've gotten, if you want to understand the dire situation under which humanity now finds itself, you need to understand central banking. And James, your epic feature-length documentary film exposes the men behind the curtain and the system of financial enslavement and control which they wield and have wielded over Americans since 1913. You and I know it goes back a couple hundred years even before that, which you cover in your documentary. This system really is the belly of the beast, and one can't be fully awake until one understands it, can they?
I certainly don't think so, and that's obviously what motivated me to create this documentary. It's called Century of Enslavement, The History of the Federal Reserve, which is something of a contentious title, I realize, but I really do feel strongly that debt is a modern form of slavery, and a very insidious one, because it's easy to see a situation where there's a master with a whip making people physically do something, to see that as a master-slave relationship. It is much more difficult to see men and women these days in suits with 1,000-watt smiles telling the cameras all of the lies in press conferences at Jackson Hole and other prestigious conferences around the world. The central bankers, who are very much enslaving the world through the debt creation system that they've pioneered, but it's much more difficult to identify that and put our finger on it. So I hope this documentary goes some way towards identifying that problem and really identifying what the root of this problem is, so that we can at least start to open the conversation towards solutions and how we can really wean ourselves off of this corrupt system.
Yeah, and I know that you guys listening know about the work of G. Edward Griffin and the creature from Jekyll Island. I've interviewed G. Edward Griffin. G. Edward Griffin appears in your documentary, James, and but you really do go extremely deep into this, and it's just a great review of the history that most people do not know. Most Americans have no idea. And you say in the documentary, and I loosely quote, "We are taught that economics is boring, but the truth is that the story of the secret banking conclave that gave birth to the Federal Reserve Act is as exciting as any Hollywood screenplay, and all the more remarkable because it's all true." And I just think it's fascinating for everybody to just reposition their understanding of history through the lens of facts, right? Because you note in the documentary that on November 22nd, 1910, in the private rail car that belonged to Senator Aldrich, the father-in-law to billionaire John D. Rockefeller, in attendance were A. Pyatt Andrew, the Assistant Treasury Secretary. Right there we can holler out treason, can't we, James? Can I just stop right there and say treason? Why was the Assistant Treasury Secretary A. Pyatt Andrew on board that train on the way to Jekyll Island?
Well, why was Senator Aldrich, and why were the two of them there with all of the conclave of banksters who at the time were openly called the Money Trust and were openly reviled by the public? Of course, the 1910 meeting occurred in the wake of the Panic of 1907, which was a financial panic that really shook Wall Street to its very core and threatened and actually did take under some of the largest institutions on Wall Street at that time, including the Knickerbocker Trust Company. So it was a time in which people were very much concerned about the monetary stability of the United States, of the dollar, and there was a great outcry when the commission that was set up in the immediate wake of the Panic of 1907 discovered that, in fact, there were three banks that basically controlled the economy of the United States. And of course, the public found that to be an unacceptable position. They were already very nervous and wary about the influence that people like J.P. Morgan wielded over the economy. And so, in the wake of that, in the midst of that, as the public are crying out for some type of solution, here you have Senator Aldrich, as you say, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., and A. Piatt Andrew, the Treasury Secretary, meeting with Benjamin Strong and Henry P. Davison and Frank Vanderlip and Paul Warburg, some of the most important and influential bankers in the United States at that time, meeting completely in secret over the course of 2 weeks there in late November, early December of 1910 on Jekyll Island, just off the coast of Georgia. And this is a remarkable story because it is a conspiracy. It is an actual, true, documented, admitted 100% conspiracy that was the genesis of what became the Federal Reserve. And again, we don't have to go out on a branch to talk about that. We can turn to Frank Vanderlip himself, one of the conspirators at the meeting, who ended up writing all about it in 25 years later in the Saturday Evening Post, in an article that is actually linked up in the transcript for this documentary on my website. And it's an absolutely admitted open conspiracy that took place where the bankers, who themselves were the ones that the public were trying to chain down with the creation of a central bank, were the ones creating that central bank. And that is such a basic ruse, such a basic point that should be taught, obviously, in any competent history course that's really trying to talk about the history of the United States and how the monetary system has come about. But of course, that basic point is completely and utterly ignored by the mainstream, to the point where you had recently a discussion on Bloomberg involving various panelists, one of which asserted that there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the Federal Reserve, without noting that the Federal Reserve itself was the result of conspiracy. Again, it's quite remarkable when you take a look at the history rather than simply just accept what's written down in the average history textbook.
That's right. And I always like to remind people, James, that when you hear names like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates bandied about as being among the world's richest men, you have to chuckle. When you know real history, you know about multi-generational banking wealth. And Jekyll Island was the home to the prestigious Jekyll Island Club, which included members like the Morgans, the Rockefellers, Warburgs, and Rothschilds. Now, therein lies the rub. If you want to know what humanity is up against, the money powers, the central banking powers, the private individual families that own and control central banks, you got to take a look at those families, right? The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Warburgs, the Morgans, J.P. Morgan, really the heart of so much trouble on Wall Street even today. And in your documentary, you note that 1913 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve was just the beginning, really, of the pain, as you and I know it now, 100 years later. But the pain goes back nearly 200 years earlier to the formation of the Bank of England.
In fact, more than that, it was 1694 that the Bank of England was formally chartered, and it came about as the result of a proposal by a Scottish banker named William Paterson. Basically, King William III was embroiled in the 9 Years' War with France, and at that time, France had won a devastating naval victory over the English Navy. And King William III was looking to rebuild the Navy and didn't have the funds to do so. So he took up William Paterson's idea to form a bank that would be given the right of note issue and in return for a £1.2 million loan to the government. And that's exactly what took place. So out of the charter that William granted this bank, King William, the bank was able to create the loan that it then loaned to the government, mostly out of thin air. There was some capital that was provided to start the bank, obviously, but at that point, it then used its charter to create the money that it then loaned to the government at interest, of course, 8% interest, and it also got the right of note issue, so it could issue its own currency. That was a pretty remarkable feat for the banking interests that were behind that idea, and unfortunately, that became a template that was continued and implemented in country after country around the globe, including, of course, the United States, where it was transported less than 100 years later towards the creation of America's first central bank, and one that most Americans, again, probably know very little about, the Bank of North America.
I just think that everybody needs to do themselves a favor, and they need to check out this fantastic documentary, Century of Enslavement, The History of the Federal Reserve. And for God's sake, if you like James as much as I do, and I know you all do, go over to his website at corbettreport.com and buy a DVD. Buy 10 DVDs. Hand them out to your friends and your family. James, can you just explain to people how they might be able to get to your site? What should they buy? I know you have all sorts of alternatives there with this DVD.
Well, the first thing that I should stress is that the documentary is 100% completely freely available online on YouTube, on my website. The best place to go to watch the documentary is corbettreport.com/Federal Reserve. And if you go there, you can find the documentary on YouTube. You can find the transcript, the hyperlinked transcript with links to everything that I talk about in the documentary. There's a little flyer that you can print off if you want to help spread the word about this documentary. And of course, you can also purchase a DVD. Again, that is just a way of supporting this work. It's a 2 DVD set. The first DVD contains the documentary itself. The second DVD contains my full 1-hour interview with G. Edward Griffin that I conducted back last December. And it runs 2,000 Japanese yen, which is about 20 American dollars, 20 Federal Reserve notes, and is the juice that I use to create the media that I'm continuing to put out at Corbett Report. Obviously, people's support is genuinely appreciated in the monetary sense, but there are many, many other ways that you can help besides. Of course, I'm always looking for translation help for the documentary, if people can translate it into other languages, even if just people want to take it and send it out to their email list, or however people want to spread the word about this. Every little bit helps, because again, this is really just intended not only, hopefully, primarily as an introduction to the Federal Reserve and why it must be resisted by the general public, but also as, I hope, as a tool for people who already have an understanding that there is something wrong with the Federal Reserve, to have a better understanding specifically what is wrong, where that history comes from, specifically what the Federal Reserve itself says about its own operations, and why it itself basically has identified its own problems if you look deeply enough. So again, that's all contained in the documentary. You can purchase a DVD if you want to support the work. And just for SGT Report listeners, if you type in the coupon code SGT10 when you're purchasing the DVD, you can get a 10% discount.
Thanks, James. And if it's okay with you, I want to transition now back to the present, because everybody appreciates your analysis and your intellect so much. I think we absolutely have to at least talk briefly about current events. But I want to say that at 1:19 and 35 seconds, an hour and 19 minutes into your documentary, I got goosebumps. And the good news is this. The goosebumps came from the End the Fed chants, at Occupy, in a big arena at a Ron Paul event. And there's an awakening happening. And that's the good news, because I always like to say, James, that the men behind the curtain have been revealed. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. And that's the beautiful thing about what's happening. And thanks to the internet, thanks to me being able to meet and talk to guys like you and understand your work and learn from it, and thanks to everybody who's really getting involved in truth media by spreading links, sharing information, spreading your 9/11 conspiracy theory documentary. By doing these things and talking about these things, the world is waking up. There's the formation of the BRICS Bank. There's this acknowledgement that all wars are bankers' wars. Max Kaiser just recently said on his recent Kaiser report, if peace were to break out, stock markets around the world would crash. And he's right. This is a war-based, insane economy based on debt and death, as my friend Chris Twain likes to say, and people have had enough. And I think, with the formation of the BRICS Bank and the de-dollarization happening between China, Russia, and India and these others, Brazil, we can see that nation states are fed up. What's your take on anything I've just said there?
I completely agree with you, and I just want to say I am so glad to hear that feedback, that you got goosebumps specifically at that particular point, because that has struck me for a number of years as being truly a goosebump-worthy moment, and I have shared that response. When you see tens of thousands of people gathered together chanting "End the Fed," understanding what the Federal Reserve is and the danger that it really represents, and the fact that it must be eliminated, that is a truly revolutionary moment, or at least potentially a truly revolutionary moment. Of course, that can be diverted away, or that can be steered down blind alleys, but I think that at least the idea of having a public that once again is truly motivated by the monetary issue and about the central banking issue, that to me is something that it really is just, it speaks of a really remarkable revolutionary moment. So I was hoping to be able to capture something of that in this documentary and let people understand just how remarkable this is. But I think you're right. Again, it is a system based on debt and death, and it is a system that more people are waking up to and more people are rejecting. That is happening at the international level, as you say, with the creation of the BRICS Development Bank, all of the bilateral trade agreements that China and Russia and others are signing right now in local currencies, the de-dollarization that's happening. But I think that there's also this is part of a dialectic, and on one side of the dialectic we have the big bad American empire and everything that it's become in terms of spreading its debt and death around the world at the point of a gun, and on the other side of that dialectic we have the emerging BRICS powers and their allies that are basically in this dialectic posited, well, these are the good side, these are the good guys that are going to use their influence and their local currencies for good. But I think it still maintains the fundamental structure that is the problem in the first place. It maintains these currencies that are created by these central banks, that are maintained and manipulated by banksters. And even if these developing countries' banksters are good people and they mean well and they're angels descended from heaven to bring happiness and peace and sunshine to the world, that doesn't mean that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, a generation from now, it couldn't turn into exactly what the Federal Reserve is today, the evil empire. And that, I think, is the real danger here, that people can be lulled into a false sense of security by these or not counter globalization, but alternative globalization forces. So the BRICS, we can put all of our eggs in the BRICS basket instead of in the American empire basket. But at the end of the day, it amounts to the same thing. So I think that the real true revolutionary idea, the real true power, comes from people organizing in ways that unleashes the true potential of individuals acting together in communities to really unlock their own potential in terms of the labor that everyone has to offer on some level. And there are lots of different ways of doing this. I highlight a few of them in the documentary. There's mutual credit systems and things of that nature that, of course, are in most cities around the United States. You just have to look hard enough, and there's usually some type of mutual credit system, some let system or something of that nature. I highlight the Ithaca Hours system in Ithaca, New York. Mm-hmm. Another idea that I'm very, very enamored with is self-issued credit, which is an idea that's been propounded by Paul Grignon of the Money as Debt series of documentary films. It's a rather intricate idea, but basically the underlying idea is that yes, a credit economy, it makes sense because it can expand or contract the money supply depending on basically the productive needs of that society, which is a good thing. But why on earth do we go cap in hand to the banksters to ask them to give us a loan that is created out of not just nothing, but created on the back of our promise to repay the banks?
Right.
Well, if our promise to repay the banks is good enough for the creation of that money, then it's good enough for the creation without the banks themselves being the middleman. And that idea that we can actually become we can actually self-issue credit is a truly revolutionary one that really does have the promise of unleashing the true productive potential of humanity in a system that isn't based on debt and debt servitude and slaving away your life to pay back a debt that you created by the magic of the bank's charter, but through an economy that relies on productive activity and promises to pay to ultimately deliver on goods and services that you can actually perform yourself. And it's a slight change in perspective that creates an entirely different system. So for people who haven't heard about self-issued credit, I really hope that they'll take a look at that. Paul Grignon has some videos on that up on his site. I've done some work on it in the past. It's a truly exciting one. But I think the point that I'm trying to stress in my documentary is that there is not just one silver bullet. There is not just one thing that we can do. I think there's many, many, many things that we can do to really unhook ourselves from the Federal Reserve System, and they're complementary. They don't have to be competitive. Well, I think they should compete with each other, but they don't have to be exclusive. I don't think that there will ever be one system that will be the system for conducting transactions online with people halfway around the world that I'll never see, and people in my local community, and people and retail stores that may be national in scope and things of that nature. These are all different types of transactions. There are different functions of money. They don't all have to be done by the exact same currency. So I think that there should be an open market, a free market in currencies, and they should be allowed to compete with each other in a complementary way. And I think that that's truly the ultimate solution here, and something that I'm hoping to propound as the way of opening this conversation up, because at this point people's imagination are limited by the system they're living in, and when our imaginations are limited, we can be steered into that false choice. Do we want the BRICS style of globalization and central bank fiat funny money, or do we want the Federal Reserve style? Well, I'm here to say that no, it isn't a choice but either or. There's many other options on the table. So let's open that menu up and start to order from it.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening to part 1 of my interview with James Corbett. Stay tuned for part 2, in which we talk about de-dollarization, MH17, Ebola, and the police state which has made itself evident in Ferguson. And visit sgtreport.com daily for real news 24/7. And thank you for caring.